Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. It's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we are actually going to talk more about the United States and our trek, our movement towards World War II in the United States entry. So let's get into it. Share thy screen. Okay, America moves towards war. So, Module 11, Lesson 3. Let's get into the nitty gritty. That was your warm up. Okay, we're going to describe the details of America's turn to isolationism in the 1930s, describe the U.S. response to the war in Europe in 1939, including how Roosevelt assisted the Allies without declaring war, key part. Summarize the events that brought the U.S. into armed conflict with Germany. And again, describe the American response to Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Dun, dun, dun. All right, need to isolate. So most Americans were alarmed by the international conflicts of the mid-30s, but many believe that the U.S. shouldn't get involved. Because of the horrors of World War I, many Americans were determined to never be involved in an international war again. If you recall, these are 3 ways during the 20s or shortly after World War I that marked the U.S. towards being isolated. One of them being in 1919. Remember, Congress refused to allow the U.S. to join the League of Nations for fear the League of Nations would control American foreign policy and it would tie the country closer to Europe. The U.S. and its allies signed a disarmament treaty at the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 and promised not to build any warships for the next decade. And in 1928, they signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact with 62 other countries to not use war as an instrument of national policy. We've already learned that, though. I'm still making you write it. Maybe a test question? It didn't, however, the Kellogg-Briand Pact didn't, however, include a way to deal with countries that broke the pledge, meaning they used war as an instrument of national policy. So in the early 1930s, numerous books argued that greedy bankers and arms dealers dragged the U.S. into World War I. There was public outrage, which will lead to a congressional committee to investigate these charges led by a guy named Gerald Nye. The Nye Committee found that banks and manufacturers had made large profits during the war. Mind you, we didn't join the war until 1917, but it wasn't to say that we weren't not supporting European nations with arms. They would be called the merchants of death. Americans became more and more determined to avoid war because they didn't want the rich, the war industries to get greedy. The news of Japan's invasion of Manchuria reached the U.S. in 1932, a whole year later. The U.S. avoided getting involved, and Secretary of State Henry Stimson notified both Japan and Chinese governments that the U.S. would not recognize this conflict. The U.S. government would continue to consider Manchuria as part of China, and the U.S. would keep all their trade rights in China. Got to keep those spheres of influence open. So here you have Uncle Sam being controlled, foreign nations, European nations, Empire of Japan, England, the League of Nations. And you've seen this about the Kellogg-Briand Pact. You have a baby, Papa, League of Nations, and you have Europe. And Uncle Sam is talking to a pretty lady. New Peace Pact, Guide to Europe. That's Gerald Nye, the war traders, wealth, war profits. Remember, being fat is a sign of wealth. and that's Henry Stimson. All right. Neutral. So Americans growing isolationism eventually affected FDR's foreign policy. He will reach out to other countries. When he took office in 1933, he officially recognized the Soviet Union, exchanged ambassadors with Moscow. That's Stalin, people. His good neighbor policy continued non-intervention policy in Latin America, which occurred under Coolidge and Hoover, and he also removed troops there. In 1934, he pushed Congress to pass the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, which lowered trade barriers by giving the president power to make trade agreements with other nations. And he hoped to reduce tariffs by as much as 50%. Congress disagreed with FDR's efforts to involve the country in foreign affairs. 1934, Congress passed the John Debt Default Act, which prohibited foreign aid loans to countries that had not paid back their World War I debts. So if you hadn't paid us back, you don't get money. And guess who that was? France and Great Britain. Congress will pass a series of neutrality acts to keep the country out of future wars. The first two were passed in 1935 and 1937, outlawing arms sales or loans to nations at war. The third act was a response to the fighting in Spain. And it will also outlaw arms sales and loans to nations engaged in civil wars. So it wasn't just like wars in general, like now it's civil wars. It had to be a little more specific. The Old Man of the Sea, a Neutrality Act, and being pulled by aid that will win, and he's not budging. Quarantine. Even though Congress passed laws to keep the country neutral, FDR found it almost impossible to remain neutral. When Japan launched a new attack on China in July 1937, FDR found a way around the Neutrality Acts. Because Japan had not formally declared war against China, the president claimed that there was no need to enforce the Neutrality Acts. So the U.S. continued sending arms and supplies to China. A few months later, FDR spoke out strongly against isolationism. He called on peace-loving nations to quarantine or isolate aggressor nations in order to stop the spread of war. Leave them be. Don't acknowledge them. They won't bother you. At last, FDR seemed ready to take a stand against aggression until isolationist newspapers exploded in protest. They accused the president of leading the nation into war. FDR will back off due to the criticism, but his speech began to shift the debate. Well, Japan really hasn't declared war. And if we isolate these countries and we don't give them the attention they need or desire, they'll stop the spread of war. Not really, though. This speech that he gives is called the quarantine speech. All right. So, as German tanks rolled across Poland, 1939, FDR will revise the Neutrality Act of 1935, and at the same time, he began to prepare the nation for the struggle he feared just lay ahead. September, FDR persuaded Congress to pass a cash and carry provision, meaning, test question, it allowed warring nations to buy U.S. arms as long as they paid cash and transported them in their own ships. FDR argued that providing arms would help France and Britain defeat Hitler and keep the U.S. out of the war. Isolationists again attacked FDR for his actions, but after 6 weeks of heated debate, Congress passed the Neutrality Act of 1939, and the cash and carry policy went into effect. But the cash and carry policy was like a little, too late. By the summer of 1940, France had fallen and Britain was under siege. FDR worked to provide British with all aid short of war, and by June had sent Britain 500,000 rifles and 80,000 machine guns. In September, the U.S. traded 50 old destroyers for leases on British military bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. In September 1927, Americans were startled 1927. This should be 1937. 1937, Americans were startled when Germany, Italy, and Japan formed a mutual defense treaty called the Tripartite Pact, or obviously would later be known as the Axis powers. It was intended to keep the U.S. out of war. Under the treaty, each Axis nation agreed to defend each other in case of an attack. This meant that if the U.S. declared on any one of the powers, the U.S. would have to fight a two-ocean war. Meanwhile, FDR will continue to ask Congress to increase spending for national defense. Despite years of U.S. isolationism, Nazi victories in 1940 changed the U.S. thinking. Congress boosted the defense spending and passed the nation's first peacetime military draft. Test question, the Selective Training and Service Act. Under this law, 16 million men between the ages of 21 and 35 were registered, and of those, 1 million will be drafted for 1 year and only serve in the Western Hemisphere. Again, staying out of the war. Europe's in the Eastern Hemisphere. The United States is in the Western Hemisphere. See? Staying out of the war. How far will it go? It's not our war. It's our war. Age short of war. These are planes. Third time's the charm. So that same year, FDR broke the tradition of a two-term presidency, began by our boy George Washington, and ran for a second re-election. FDR's Republican opponent was a utilities executive named Wendell Willkie. He actually supported FDR's aid to Britain, which isolationists didn't like at the same time. Both Willkie and FDR promised to keep the U.S. out of war. So, since there was no major differences between the two, voters chose to elect someone who was more familiar, so FDR won with 55% of the votes, popular votes. Once re-elected, FDR continued his drive to provide aid to the Allies and fight the Axis powers. He said in a fireside chat that it would be impossible to negotiate a treaty with Hitler. If Britain fell, the Axis powers would be left unchallenged to take over the world. He said the U.S. must help defeat the Axis threat, and it become a great arsenal of democracy. By late 1940, so just basically a year into the war, Britain had no more cash to spend on arms, and as a result, the Johnson Debt Default Act, FDR was unable to lend money to Britain directly. So FDR tried to help by suggesting a new policy called a lend-lease policy. Under this, test question, under this plan, the president would lend or lease arms, not these, guns to other supplies to any country whose defense was vital to the U.S. So if Britain and France are vital to democracy in Europe, that's important to us. So we're going to go help them. The Lend-Lease Act passed March 19, that should be 41, not 31. 1941. Britain wasn't the only nation that received Lend-Lease aid. When Hitler will break off his agreement with the USSR and invade the Soviet Union. So FDR is like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Acting on principle, FDR worked to improve the diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. He started sending Lend-Lease aid to Stalin. As a result, American industries began shifting to wartime production before the U.S. entered the war. Defense spending skyrocketed and idle factories came back to life. They changed from making consumer goods to producing war supplies. So, merry-go-round companies made gun mounts. Stove factories made lifeboats. Toy makers made compasses. Pinball machines made piercing armor shells. The increase in production did what all the programs the New Deal could not do, end the Great Depression. So with factories hiring again, unemployment began to shrink rapidly, falling by 900,000 people by September 1941. And by the end of 1941, America was going back to work. Lend-Lease Act, aid to our allies. That's China, Britain, Soviet Union. Here's a factory, as you can see, lots of women working. Okay, me and my wolf pack. FDR was a popular president, but received constant criticism for his foreign policy. He realized that the American forces were seriously underarmed, so he will take numerous actions to ensure the U.S. would be prepared when that time came. Lend-Lease aid was helping, but supply lines across the Atlantic Ocean had to be kept open to deliver the goods to Britain and the Soviet Union. Hitler will try to prevent the delivery of Lend-Lease shipments by sending out hundreds of German submarines, U-boats, Unterseeboots, to attack the supply ships. From the spring through the fall 1941, attacks by U-boats were replaced by a wolf pack attack. At night, groups of up to 40 submarines patrolled the North Atlantic where convoys would be expected. Wolf packs would be successful in sinking as much as 350,000 tons. Remember, a ton is 2,000 pounds, so 700,000 pounds of shipments in a single month. In June 1941, FDR granted the Navy permission to use U.S. warships to attack German U-boats in self-defense, called shoot on sight. In 1941, August, FDR and Churchill met secretly at a summit aboard the USS Augusta. Although Churchill was hoping for a commitment, he will settle for a joint declaration of war goals called the Atlantic Charter. Both countries pledged collective security, disarmament, self-determination, economic cooperation, and freedom of the seas. Hearing that, you're like, Woodrow Wilson is super pissed off. Remember, he's the guy who created the League of Nations and had those goals in it. His 14 points. FDR couldn't ask Congress for a declaration, but he would wage war and do everything to force an incident. Sounds a little peculiar if you don't mind me saying. Interesting to say. Here are convoys, U.S. warships on the outside. That's the wolf pack. These are, I couldn't really find wolf pack U-boats. These are the pictures you get. This is the Atlantic Charter. FDR on the left, Churchill on the right. You sank my battleship. So the Atlantic Charter became the new basis of a document called the Declaration of the United Nations. FDR suggested the term United Nations to express the common purpose of allies who will fight the Axis powers. It was signed January 1st, 1942 by 26 nations, and by the end of the war, 21 more signed it. After a German submarine fired on the U.S. destroyer Greer in the Atlantic Ocean, September 4th, 1941, FDR ordered Navy commanders to respond and shoot the submariners on sight. 2 weeks later, the American merchant ship Pink Star was sunk off of Greenland. Mid-October, a U-boat sank the U.S. destroyer Kearney and 11 lives were lost. Days later, U-boats torpedoed the U.S. destroyer Reuben James, killing more than 100 sailors. As the death toll mounts, the Senate repealed a ban against Army merchant ships, and a formal declaration for a full-scale war seemed inevitable. Here's a ship destroyed at sea. Oil and peace. So, the U.S. was involved in an undeclared naval war with Hitler, but the attack that finally brought the U.S. into the war came from the attacks created by Japan. By the late fall of 1941, American leaders became convinced a war between the U.S. and Japan was likely, but the questions remained, how and where would it start? By early 1941, Japanese had pushed westward into Manchuria and other parts of China. They set their sights on European colonial possessions to the south. European powers were too busy fighting Hitler to block Japanese expansion, so they easily overran. The U.S. and its Pacific islands were the only things that remained in Japan's way. So the Japanese began a southward push in July 1941, taking over French military bases in Indochina. Indochina makes up the countries of today, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So, test question. The U.S. protested this aggression by halting trade with Japan. However, one item the Japanese could not live without was oil for its war machine. The Japanese leaders warned that a lack of oil could defeat Japan with its enemies without even striking a blow. Their leaders declared that Japan either persuade the U.S. to end its oil embargo or capture oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. Any attack would mean war either way. Shortly after becoming the Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo met with Emperor Hirohito to promise that the Japanese government would try and keep the peace with the United States. But on November 5th, Tojo ordered the Japanese Navy to prepare for an attack on the United States. The U.S. broke Japan's secret communication codes and learned that Japan was preparing an attack, but they didn't know, again, when or where. So FDR will send a war warning to Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines that if war couldn't be avoided, make sure that Japan has to make the first overt act. So basically, take some losses. After the oil embargo, representatives of the two nations met to settle their own growing differences. The U.S. wanted Japan out of China. Japan refused. The peace talks went on until December 6, 1941, when FDR decoded a message which instructed Japan's peace envoy to refuse all American peace proposals. So here you have the U.S. Uncle Sam putting a kink into U.S. oil, and nothing's coming out for the Japanese war machine. And here's basically Japan's empire. And the U.S. cut off sales of iron and oil with the Japanese. Japan interpreted that embargo as interfering with their right to expand. All right, infamy. Last slide. So early the next morning, a Japanese dive bomber flew low over Pearl Harbor, the largest U.S. naval base in the Pacific. The bomber was followed by more than 180 Japanese warplanes from 6 aircraft carriers. The Japanese bombs began falling on the base. For an hour and a half, the Japanese planes attacked. Ships docked in the harbor. U.S. anti-aircraft guns had little effect, and the planes hit target after target. By the last plane leaving was around 9:30 a.m. There was widespread devastation. The Japanese goal had been to weaken the U.S. naval power in the Pacific, and they thought this would keep the Americans from preventing Japanese expansion, and that they were successful. So in less than 2 hours, 2,400 Americans were killed. Another 1,100 were wounded. The surprise attack sunk or damaged 21 ships, including 8 battleships, nearly the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. More than 300 aircraft were severely damaged or destroyed, and this damage taken was greater than any damage combined by the U.S. Navy that they faced in World War I. But by chance, 3 aircraft carriers were still out at sea, will escape this disaster, and their survival, these 3 aircraft carriers, will be the survival and the key to the war's outcome. In Washington, D.C., the mood ranged from outrage to panic. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, giving his most famous speech ever. In his speech, FDR will ask for a declaration of war against Japan, which will be quickly approved. Terrible damage was done to Pearl Harbor, but it also to the cause of isolationism. After the attack, many isolationists supported a strong American response. And I believe that's the USS Arizona. One of the battleships. Here's more boom booms. Here's the destruction aftermath. And here is the USS Arizona today. This is the Pearl Harbor War Memorial Museum, and this is the sunken ship, and this is the museum sadly, I went to Oahu shortly after I graduated college and was unable to visit Pearl Harbor. So if you guys ever get a chance to, I would highly recommend it. I know that's on, you could say that's on my bucket list, being a history nerd. Yeah. Oh, war. Oahu bombed by Japan planes. And this is FDR giving that speech the very next day. All right. We finished. Hey, I believe I'm looking up your homework. Okay, your homework is page 516, 516, 4 through 6. 516, 4 through 6. So hopefully you guys did enjoy that. I know it was a little longer. 20 minutes, maybe 20. So yeah, that's Pearl Harbor. And we will watch Pearl Harbor, at least the fight scene in class. So hope you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.